And first of all, let's explain. You're based in Windsor. For those who don't know, that's right across the river from Detroit. But you really own several steel fabrication plants making pipe. I think you're the largest independent maker of steel pipe in the United States of America. So let's come back to you and ask this question about tariffs versus quotas. What is the right way to approach this?
Well, I think ultimately the right way to approach this is with quotas. That's what the industry has advocated. Your last guest, I just heard the last part about talking about Bush's 201 back in the early 2000s. He claimed it was unsuccessful. It was unsuccessful in the end because they stopped it after 18 months. This thing needed to be in place for much longer, and if not even permanently. So, you know, that was a temporary measure that you saw the end result when they lifted it.
Well, so, Barry, just to interrupt you, they stopped it because there was a WTO proceeding, and they were told it was illegal, and so they backed down. Would you advocate going forward with this, even if it meant it really disrupted WTO, even pulling out of WTO?
Well, listen, this is a whole other argument. The WTO is a joke, in my opinion. It's completely set up to be against the U.S. President Donald Trump is right in that fact. I mean, to sit there and have the world's largest economic power have one vote at the WTO is a farce. So, to be quite honest with you, I wouldn't pay much attention to the WTO, and I'd tell them to go pound salt. Now, the America has been the most open market in the world, and it has been abused for many, many years and decades. And we see the end result of this. A chronic $800 billion trade deficit is not healthy, and we're heading down the wrong path. So I actually advocate for quotas. I don't care if the product comes in cheap. At that point, we draw a line in the sand, and then we have to make the product here, and we have to employ people here. I've got multiple plants that are shut down that could be restarted if these illegal imports were at least held at bay. And we could employ great American teammates and Canadian teammates, and probably more people in Mexico as well, if we actually stop the rest of the world from abusing our trade laws and our trade systems and taking advantage of us.
Well, sure, but Canada, Mexico, and the EU, I mean, their trade laws are not illegal. They just happen to import more. But why not take a strategy then like Alcoa that winds up having large production, say, in Canada, so you wind up getting a cheaper production profile, just not in the U.S.? I mean, why does it have to be sort of these tit-for-tat trade to make your business operate well? If it's all a free market, why not go that way?
No. Well, hold on a minute. My business is both Canada-based and U.S.-based, actually more plants in the U.S. So there's not a tit-for-tat to make my business operate better. I mean, we're talking about competing against governments. We're talking about competing against countries who are printing money. I mean, don't tell me that we're not manufacturing efficient here, where I take a ton of steel, convert it into a ton of tubing, all right, at a lower cost than it is for the ocean freight from China or the Philippines or Vietnam. So that ocean freight alone is more expensive than what it costs me to make the products. So it's obviously being subsidized by something. Iron ore around the world costs the same. As a matter of fact, in the U.S., iron ore, coking coal, electricity, transportation, all of those inputs are less than they are in the rest of the world. So theoretically, we're more competitive, but we're not when it's subsidized by governments. And this is the whole issue. And then they use massive amounts of circumvention and third-party shipping and third-party transformation to move this product into here and take our jobs and take our employment. And it takes away from the economic engine. So this has to stop, and it's going to stop now.
So, Steve, at base, is this fundamentally a trade issue or is it actually a fiscal issue? In the sense that as long as we are borrowing as much money as we are as the United States, doesn't that almost inevitably lead to a trade deficit?
Well, true. The math is such that if you run a budget deficit, you're likely to run a current account deficit. But let's put that piece aside, because let me just say a couple things. Number one, there are a lot of trade abuses around the world. We should police them as best we can. Number two, if you go back to your study of early economics and comparative advantage, some countries make things more efficiently and cheaply than other countries. Not every country can make everything as cheaply and efficiently as another. We're in a situation now, whether it's autos or steel or any number of things, where other countries have gotten very good at making this using, in many cases, lower cost labor. And we therefore will make less of it. That is simply economic change. It happens. We're not going to always make the same amount of steel we made in 1945. It's just not going to happen. And lastly, with respect to those 2001 tariffs, the issue was that they cost more jobs than they save, because when you raise the cost of steel, you then drive employment of people who use that steel out of this country because the cost of the input is higher.
Look, I take exception to that. When you talk about the cost of labor in steel, do you realize that it's 0.4 man-hours per ton? The cost of labor is about $16 to $18 a ton on a product that is now selling for $800. So please don't tell me it's the cost of labor in another country. It's actually a very a low labor product to make. And when you talk about the cost of steel in a product that forces stuff overseas, let's put it into perspective. The cost of steel in a car is minuscule compared to the price of the car. The cost of steel in a building is minuscule. The cost of steel in a piece of gym equipment is, 2 or 3% of the cost. So please don't tell me that the cost of steel has driven away jobs out of this economy. It may have been done through sheer greed and people trying to make a quarterly number, but the cost of steel, even though steel is in everything, is actually a very small component of the end product. So that argument's a farce.